Good morning or good afternoon, and welcome to my presentation on reflecting on listening, metacognitive insights from learner journals. My name is Naheen Madarbakus, and I'm currently at Nagoya University of Commerce and Business here in Nagoya in Japan. Today's presentation will focus on learner journal reflections and what we can learn from them. This will be in the context of listening, which I will firstly define, and then we will look at what are the current learner reflections in the field. I will then outline my methodology and then also present my results from classroom instruction and self-led learners before introducing my discussion on how to use TED Talks-based listening instruction with journals, and also outline the pedagogical implications from this study. So first of all, it's very important to understand what is listening. And by this, I mean, what are the listening processes and how do we listen just in general terms. Listening processes can be divided into 4 different processes. So first of all, we can look at neurological processing, which is basically what we do with the input, how we notice it, how we hear it, and how we attend to it. Pragmatically, we are looking at how we can relate verbal or non-verbal input to our own ideas. So thinking of pre-existing ideas to then formulate some kind of meaning. Linguistic and semantic processes are the other 2 processes involved with listening, and these are perhaps more familiar in the classroom. So linguistically, we're looking at how we perceive speech in the input, how we use prosodic features such as intonation or stress, and then how we pass speech or break it down to listen to it. Semantically, we're looking at how we can use our own memory and prior experiences, not only of language, but of listening input itself, and then creating meaning with some kind of social frames or particular pragmatic boundaries that we've used from before. We can also use maybe listening with the interpretation of the input, thinking about how our students put that together or how it is assembled, and then think about our comprehension or the meaning before introducing some kind of two-way traffic or integration with the other skills. So even at this point, it's very important to understand how we can use listening with productive skills such as writing and speaking. If we want to view listening processes more technically, we can have a look at this cognitive and metacognitive process model drawn up by Van der Grift and Go. We can see here in the middle the perception, passing, and utilization which takes place when we listen to any input. The speech bubbles in the side, so speech, linguistic knowledge, prior knowledge, and representation in speech and memory represent the different processes I just introduced. What we do with that then is we take the input and we perceive it. So that would be the perception, so what we think of it. The passing would be how we break it down. And the utilization would be how we use or respond to that message that we have just listened to. We can decode these messages by responding to them or by doing nothing at all. In the classroom, we can use top-down and bottom-up processing. So we can look at maybe how we can break down messages into word-level comprehension, or we can think about top-down processing and think about more context-level comprehension to help our students understand the message more. Ultimately, when we are looking at learner journals and reflection, we are using the process of metacognition, and that allows our students opportunities to think about how they can reflect on their listening, how they can monitor and address any of the difficulties that they have, how they can evaluate what they have listened to, and then regulate their understanding with the use of listening strategies. It's easier to focus and use this model in an actual listening lesson. And Go in 2018 created the task-based metacognitive instruction for listening model, or TBMIL, as I like to call it. And this was divided up into the following tasks. So first of all, we had the stage of pre-listening, which would include strategic planning tasks and language knowledge tasks. So this is maybe in our before listening, when we are thinking about what strategies we can use. And we can also look at maybe using language knowledge. So, and then we can think about how we use vocabulary, what vocabulary we know, and what we know about the topic before we listen. After having the actual listening task, we can then think about post-listening. So what content we can use for communicative purposes, if we can check our understanding of the listening together. But and then the main part, which adds from the journal, is the evaluation and reflection, which this task can give to our students. Ultimately, we can divide a listening lesson into 5 different stages, which will assure us this perception and this passing and utilization opportunities, as well as give our students opportunities to reflect on what they have just heard. So it's important to have a look maybe at our learner reflections now. So what is that exactly? So we can look at metacognitive listening lessons, and we can define metacognition as our ability to think about our own thinking, and by extension to think about how we process information for a range of purposes and manage the way that we do that. So it's how we can control our learning. It's very, very learner-centered, and it's very, very learner-focused in terms of us being able to understand and to be able to fix our own mistakes. Simply put, we can also take our metacognitive knowledge and think about how our learners store 3 kinds of knowledge about their cognition, so which includes person, task, and strategy metacognitive knowledge. To go into more detail into these 3 different types of knowledge, I'd like to show you this table here, which shows you the metacognitive learner journal divisions. There are many, many definitions when it comes to using metacognitive knowledge. So I'd like us to focus on the 2018 definition, as this seems to be the simplest. And with person knowledge, you can see that this is the knowledge that we have about ourselves, or how a student would reflect on their own knowledge of doing something. Task knowledge refers to the nature and the demands of the task we undertake, or how we reflect on the activity that we have just done. And strategy knowledge looks at the strategies or conscious steps that we have taken to improve our performance or achieve a goal. So this actually reflects on the listening process as a whole. This could be the lesson, or this could be the activity. As we can see that there are many, many different definitions when it comes to metacognitive knowledge, but understanding the main aspects of giving students the opportunity to reflect on their person, their task, and their strategy knowledge is key when we are using journals. There are many previous studies which have looked at using learner journals to understand listening more and to gain an insight into what students do into their processes. So first of all, we can see that in person knowledge, that Seagal found that learners are quite positive when they are approaching any of their listening tasks. They're motivated, but he did find that they need more confidence in being able to listen to different texts on their own, and perhaps they need more strategies out of class to help them with their confidence. In task knowledge, Seagal in the same paper, and also Graham in 2006, tried to investigate tasks and what listening tasks students used and how they felt about them. The learners reported that they preferred familiar tasks, so ones that they knew week in and week out, and that they were wary of task failure because they thought that there was a direct link between the task and their test scores. So therefore, not being able to perform solidly in a class meant that perhaps they weren't able to perform solidly in an end-of-course test. Lastly, in strategy knowledge, Seagal and Graham also looked into how their learners felt about their strategies. And learners tended to confuse procedures and strategies, so they didn't know what was an instruction or what was a strategy that would help them to overcome their listening difficulties. And overall, that they perceived strategies as difficult. So this wasn't seen as something that could help them in their listening. It was seen as something maybe that was a scary word. So all of this data and all of this current research led me to my own methodology, and I wanted to find out what my learners felt about listening in their own journals. To give you a brief study overview, I did ask teachers and learners about the current situation first before I did use journals in their actual listening lessons. And 15 teachers and learners from 5 classes completed an online survey and were interviewed just so I could find out what their current attitudes were on their listening lessons. In phase 2, which is what this presentation will focus on today, there was a classroom intervention where there were classes which used a listening lesson which I developed. To give you more details about that, so the data was collected from a pre-sessional program in a university in New Zealand, where the classes received 20 hours of instruction over 14 weeks. There were 3 classes involved in all, so there were 2 B2 classes, which were upper intermediate levels, and there was a B1 class, which was served at a B1 level intermediate. All of the classes had integrated listening strategies in terms of the intervention classes, but we can see here that only 2 of the classes in the 3 conditions received any of the listening strategies. These were used with TED Talk lessons, so these were developed to be a listening lesson using a TED Talk, and there were self-study instruction learners where there were 13 participants, and there were classroom instruction participants in the classroom instructed class, which I taught myself, and there were 11 participants there. Each of these intervention lessons included 5 75-minute lessons, which were taught on alternate weeks. These students were also asked to complete a pre-course and a post-course survey. They took part in focus groups, and they were asked to complete listening journals after their listening lessons. For the actual research instruments, we're not going to look at the survey today, so I'd like to just show you what the learner journals came up with. So in the classroom instruction and self-study lessons where they were used, what kind of listening strategies and TED Talks based listening lessons led to their strategy use. And I'd also like to use focus groups, so to show you what the learners felt about learning from this lesson and their experience of learning from the TED Talks lessons. For the actual journal, there were 3 different prompts which were used. These were combined from a number of different research papers. So the initial prompts were taken from TESOL 2013, which divided up the journal into observations, reflections, and goals. The metacognitive focus looked at Flavel's person knowledge, task knowledge, and strategy knowledge, which we looked at in the metacognitive knowledge. And example questions were used and adapted from Rowe and Chen's 2013 and 2016 papers. The focus groups that were included also took questions from Seagal, and these looked at looking at the background in learning listening, the general listening practices, and the reflections on strategy use. I also asked students to talk about their listening in future to see if they would incorporate any of these strategies. So with the data processing, I had the data from the focus group and the listening journal. And with the focus group, first of all, the intervention resulted in getting journals from 24 learners. And I used an information letter and a consent form to ask them if I could use both their journals and their interviews. The journals which they completed in the lesson were typed up, and the interviews were transcribed verbatim after they were recorded. In terms of data analysis, thematic analysis from Braun and Clark were followed using the 6 stages, i.e. the coding, the transcribing, and the categorizing. And these were transcribed and anonymized, so I didn't know who the students were. And then they were organized by the sub-questions as guided by the focus group questions and the research questions. I managed to identify the themes using and correlating the journals and the focus groups together, and then I omitted any recurring themes and added any new themes which were needed. This resulted in 3 research questions for this study. So number 1 was, how did the learners feel about their listening experience of self-led and classroom-based metacognitive instruction according to learner reports? So looking at person knowledge. Question 2 looked at how did the learners feel about the listening tasks in the self-led and classroom-based metacognitive instruction according to learner self-reports. This was focusing on task knowledge. And question 3 was, how did the learners feel about the listening strategies in their self-led and classroom-based metacognitive instruction according to learner self-reports, which focused on the strategy knowledge. So if we have a look at the results with the learner reflections, here are the 6 prompts which were used on the journal. So the first 2 look at using person knowledge, the number 3 and 4 look at task knowledge, and number 5 and 6 look specifically at strategy knowledge. So we'll look at each of those questions in turn now. So first of all, with the results for person knowledge, I asked, how do you feel about listening? And the general response was listening is interesting. A student here says, yes, I think listening is something interesting because of the topic. So they related the topic to the interest level, and it also made them like English a lot more by the end of the course. It also improved their listening, as the student says here. So especially being able to take notes and use vocabulary, they felt that this improved their whole process of being able to listen. Finally, familiar topics made listening easier to understand. So topics were used which were in line with the curriculum and also with the other themes which were used on the course, which were closely aligned to SDGs. So even if there were some difficult topics, being able to understand and link that to other information from other classes in their courses was very, very useful for students. In person knowledge, I also asked them what helps you understand while you listen. And the self-led group said that interacting with the text, so being able to use subtitles, background information on the speaker, and also repeating sections in their own time were quite useful. One student explains here that using TED Talks, so being able to use the transcript, which is interactive, being able to use subtitles, and just being able to compare their listening at their own speed was helpful in helping them to focus. In classroom instruction, this changed a little because they were able to interact with each other more easily. So they felt that discussing and monitoring were much easier for them. So being able to check with each other with words that they didn't know, being able to clarify any concepts that were heard, and being able to kind of work out anything which was unknown was very, very useful in the classroom instruction environment. In task knowledge, the question was, what tasks help you to listen today? And generally speaking, students tended to prioritize vocabulary activities as the vocabulary was difficult. They felt that the vocabulary was familiar, and they also felt that, for example, natural and simple words needed to be explained, but then they knew what to focus on. The difficulties that they found were writing while they were listening. So cognitively, this still has a lot of demands, and especially when the student felt that their paper was blank by the end of the day, that this did not really motivate them. Also, another difficulty was understanding the speaker's rate of speech and their talk details. So not being able to understand what they said, but the opposite, writing down anything that they heard or what they saw on the screen didn't necessarily mean that the student felt that they understood what the talk was about. In strategy knowledge, the question was, what strategies helped you to accomplish the task? So writing notes was seen as an important listening goal. So being able to write notes and being able to pick out the key information, whether it was the speaker being able to emphasize those points, or if it was the same points as being used on the PowerPoint, this helped the student to understand what were the main details that they needed to know. The second question, what strategies will help you improve your performance, included prioritizing understanding vocabulary through listening. So being able to combine the listening with the speaking and being able to use that vocabulary before and after the talk would perhaps help in terms of being able to understand the main idea in the talk more easily. So this leads us to our discussion. So just a summary of all of those main results there. So in person knowledge, the students reported that listening is interesting. They felt that this particular method helped them to improve their listening, and they felt that familiar topics made their listening easier to understand the process. In task knowledge, they felt that prioritizing vocabulary activities was perhaps a little bit easier for them to understand difficult vocabulary. They felt that writing notes while listening was very difficult, and it was something that they'd like to practice. And they thought that the speaker's rate of speech and the talk details and picking out the main details was still very difficult for them to do. In strategy knowledge, they do understand the importance of writing notes as they listen as an important listening goal. And they also feel that prioritizing understanding new vocabulary throughout the lesson, whether that's before, while, or after speaking, is also important. So this leads us to our summary of the self-study and classroom instruction. So in all learners had a very, very positive attitude towards their listening using this technique. They thought that their listening was, their lessons were interesting, and that they believed that their listening improved by the end of the course of 5 different lessons. They tend to prioritize vocabulary activities, although they find vocabulary difficult. And although they prioritize writing notes, they still find it difficult, although they understand the value in this. They feel that the speaker's rate of speech and topic is still quite difficult to understand, so they try to use and pick particular vocabulary and keywords to understand the listening. In self-led instruction, there were some particular points which were specific to this type of instruction. The learners felt that familiar topics were easier, and they felt that interacting with the resource, so using the transcript, being able to listen in sections, and also use subtitles when they needed to, were very, very useful. In classroom instruction, they were able to interact with each other, so discussion with each other, being able to check and monitor their understanding as they go along, but also they were able to discuss vocabulary throughout the lesson and also make predictions at the beginning as well as check them afterwards. So the pedagogical implications to help for effective listening practice would be that we need opportunities in the listening classroom to use authentic practices. So familiar resources which have interactive tasks like TED Talks, there are a host of other different resources as well which we can use, but being able to expose our students to such authentic and natural language is quite important. Being able to prime vocabulary, especially before listening, and then being able to follow that up both while listening and after listening is quite important. Being able to start at bottom-up levels, so we can help our students understand what the word level understanding is, and then being able to build up to a more contextual and opinionated level in top-down level approaches is very important. Being able to also scaffold note-taking, so whether that's encouraging our students to chunk different phrases that they hear, use symbols or images to draw their interpretations before they write, is also very encouraging. So being able to take away those cognitive demands before they are able to kind of take notes in real time would be also helpful for students. Ultimately, this study has hopefully suggested that metacognitive approaches are quite valuable in class. So being able to give our students monitoring opportunities and being able to evaluate their understanding can really, really help improve their comprehension. Being able to use process-based tasks, so things like learner journals, being able to give our students opportunities to discuss, being able to set goals, being able to identify their difficulties are all also very important. And strategy-based instruction, so being able to have tasks which kind of integrate both metacognitive and cognitive aspects, so being able to reflect on ideas, but also being able to understand what is the text about, are also valuable techniques for the classroom. So here are my references, and if there are any questions, please feel free to ask me. Thank you.